Partners in Crime, Chapter 12, Interrogation. It took Rook a moment to realize that Jen, in her Kraho form, was shivering. Esther pulled up short of hopping out of the manhole. She turned to Jen, who had pulled her hands back and was rubbing her arms. "When did it get so cold?" she asked, blowing into her hands, her breath a visible cloud. "Now you know why the Kraho need the fusion engine," Esther pointed out as Jen slapped a shivering hand to the Omnitrix symbol on her belt. She shuddered a bit more before she began to warm back up. Esther nodded and pushed up the manhole. "They can't follow us out here. Too cold." Jen nodded slightly and frowned. "How come you're okay?" Esther smiled, stretching. "I'm only half Kraho. To me, it's just a bit nippy out." Jen nodded slightly. Rook frowned. But before he could say anything, they were called to by a group of Kinnisellaran children. They all seemed to know Esther on sight and were excited to see her, quickly dragging her out for their street hockey game. Rook caught Jen by the wrist. "We were chasing a thief. There she is." Jen nodded. "And she no longer has what she stole, and we don't know where they took it. Besides, she saved our lives. Give me some time. We'll get it worked out." Rook frowned slightly but nodded. She knew more about this area than he did. After all, between her and her cousin, they'd turned one of their more formidable enemies into their friend. He'd read all about Kevin Levin in Jen's file, and wondered if this would be a similar situation. After all, Kevin had an attraction to Gwen, and Esther was clearly attracted to Jen. Rook frowned, leaning against a tree as Esther pulled Jen into the game. He wasn't sure how he felt about all of this. Jen knew there could be no more stalling for answers when the lava began to flow from the ground. Rook was right, this was the Kraho. She managed to stop the flow on the street they were on, unlocking Arctiguana for the first time. She'd seen her future self use this transformation when she and Gwen had traveled into the future when they were kids, but she'd never used it herself. She hopped off the car she'd been using onto the now cooled lava rock. "We need to put an end to this. Now." Rook nodded, pointing towards downtown Bellwood. "The lava is still coming. What happens when it flows down into Undertown?" A few of the Kinnisellaran children began to cry. Jen shot Rook a reproachful look. "I'm not going to let that happen. Esther, I need your help. They took the fusion engine to do this." Esther shook her head, panic in her eyes. "They just wanted to make it warm down there." Jen nodded. "In the place they told you to go, the hot spot. I need you to take us there." "You're asking me to betray my people." Jen shook her head. "No, I'm not asking." She gave a pointed glance to the lava that still flowed. Esther looked over it and deflated, almost literally, before nodding. "I'll lead you." She kept her word, too, leading them to the hot spot. It was actually quite nice, if very warm, with pools of lava. A few caverns away, the upsurge of lava had caused a few natural pools to turn into hot springs. Jen held a hand over her mouth as Rook caused his distraction. One of these days she was going to have to ask him where he'd learned to play tag. She transformed into Energy, one of her only transformations capable of handling the fusion engine directly. That was made even easier when the Kraho spotted her and tried to stop her by ripping open the containment suit that held Energy in a form that made it safe for others to be around her. She spun through the air, a free energy being, easily melting through the machine holding the engine. She took it out. It was warm in her hands. It wasn't like she could do anything else, so she swallowed it whole and used the energy she gained to destroy the machine pumping the lava. With Esther placed in charge of the Kraho, Jen took Rook back to the surface so he could cool back down. She chuckled slightly as he chugged the pitcher of lemonade. She handed the girl at the stand a 20. "You doing okay, Rook?" He nodded as he finished off the lemonade. "You really shouldn't chug it. You're probably dehydrated. All that fur, I should have thought of it. Sorry." He shook his head. "I was aware, going in, that I might be a hindrance in conditions like that. I should have made you more aware." Jen shook her head. "It's okay, Rook. We both made it out. I'll have a lot of paperwork over what happened to the fusion engine, but Esther should be able to keep her people in line. Today's a win. Peace, which is always the goal." Rook nodded. "Was that your original goal when you faced the hybrid?" Jen sighed slightly as they made their way towards town. They'd left the proto-truck downtown. It would be a long walk. That was a complicated situation. I wasn't sure what I was going to do for a while. Then I met Riney. As they walked, Jen told him the story that she hadn't even told Gwen and Kevin. Rook was easy to talk to. It ended up working out for everyone. Now I'm his son's godmother. Got a call from him a few weeks ago before we met. He and his mate are having another one. They're hoping for a girl this time. Rook smiled. A nice breeze had kicked up and cooled things off quite a bit as they walked. By the time they made it downtown, clouds had rolled in and it was starting to rain. Jen didn't have either of her jackets on her. She'd been switching between her signature green to a sage green hoodie with a black number 10 on the upper right chest, but given how warm the day had started, she had neither with her. They were already mostly soaked when he remembered the small umbrella in one of the compartments of his armor. He pulled it out and unfurled it from its tiny stay. It easily covered the two of them. She grinned at him. Thanks. He nodded, and they continued on their way to the proto-truck. Chapter 13. The Plan. Jen laughed lightly as she flopped down on the floor of the training hall. Rook was a few feet away, sitting on the ground. He chuckled lightly, glancing around. I believe that the cleaning staff is beginning to resent us. Jen laughed louder, looking around the wrecked room. They had been training again with a few of her newer forms. She was hesitant to use her Kraho form outside of the hot spot since it was so cold for her, but she'd tried out a few forms she hadn't had the chance to try out since she'd gotten them. She had gained quite a few forms when she and the Plumbers had discovered an illegal alien prison under Area 51. She'd only had time to try one so far while she and Rook were training. She decided to try a few out. She really liked the one she was calling Shayera, a humanoid, but with large gray wings attached to her arms and talon-like feet. She looked a lot like harpies in old stories. Jen had debated the name for a while. She shook her head. Nah, I've made worse messes, she said as one of the walls that had been teetering finally crashed to the ground. Rook snorted out a laugh. I completely believe that. She nodded as he stood and shook his head slightly. I am going to get some drinks. Jen nodded, shooting him a thumbs up as he walked to the door. I'll be right here. He shook his head slightly as he left. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she slipped it out, not bothering to sit up as she checked the caller ID and grinned. Gwen! She called as she answered the call. Hey, Jen, how's life? Jen shrugged, still laying on the floor. Oh, you know, the usual. Getting attacked practically every day by a shape-shifting dog thing. Not a whole lot happening. There was silence over the line for a moment. You got that handled? Jen nodded. Rook and I are working on a plan, yeah. Speaking of, did you and Kevin know I was getting a new partner? Gwen cleared her throat. Maybe. You could have told me. I know I'm good on the fly, but a plan helps. Gwen sighed. We didn't think you'd take it all that well. You seem to be taking it pretty well, though. How is he? I only read his file, never actually met him. Jen sat up. He's pretty cool. A bit odd, but hey, when has that ever stopped us? Gwen laughed. He's also really tall. Gwen laughed again. Couldn't be that you're a little shorter than average. Jen shook her head at her phone. No. Anyway, how are classes, college girl? They're all right. Not a lot of excitement, just homework. Jen laughed. I told you you'd miss it. Gwen laughed. Yeah, well, I wanted to check in between classes. I have to run. Stay in touch, doofus. You too, dweeb. Jen hung up the phone and pulled herself to her feet as Rook re-entered the room holding a few water bottles. Is everything all right? Jen nodded, pulling the cap and chugging half a water bottle in one go. Yeah, I had a thought, though. We need a break. Have you ever played video games? Rook shook his head. There's a new one coming out I want to test out. Feel like coming with? Rook nodded. That sounds like an interesting experience. Wildmutt tore at the beast that was attacking them, wrestling with it, when a high-pitched whistle cut through the air. It was like taking a knife to both the ear and the eye. Wildmutt saw with every sense but sight, but mostly relied on hearing and smell. She rolled away from the attacking thing, howling in pain, paws going to her ears to try and block the sound. She barely noticed when she transformed back to herself, her ears still ringing. The thing would have taken a chunk out of her if Rook hadn't fired a few shots at it, sending it running. He pulled her to her feet. "Are you all right?" Jen rubbed her ears. "Don't tell me you didn't just hear that." Rook blinked. "Okay, I will not. What is it that I heard, though?" Jen laughed lightly, still rubbing her ears. They both turned as the beast roared and lunged at them again. Rook fired twice. He hit it once, and it turned to run. He fired again and missed as the beast vanished in a cloud of foul-smelling mist. "I am sorry, that almost never happens." Jen shook her head. "What, missing a shot?" "It happens, Rook. It's okay." She patted him on the shoulder. He frowned. "What are you doing?" "It's a human thing, like, they're there. It's okay. It's supposed to make you feel better." Rook frowned. "Why would that make anyone feel better?" Jen shook her head slightly as they headed to the proto-truck. "I didn't make it up. Humans are very tactile beings. Comfort for us is best done through physical contact. Well, for most people. Some people just don't like being touched." She shrugged as she buckled her seatbelt. "Head to the base. I have a thought to run by Grandpa Max." Rook nodded. After wrangling the creature Grandpa Max was cooking for lunch, the three of them sat down at the table. Max and Rook had bowls of the soup, but Jen had claimed to not be hungry. "Okay, so I have an idea. This thing that's been coming after me, there's clearly some kind of intelligence behind it." Rook nodded at her words. "When you turned into a lepidopteran, the creature immediately transformed into a bug lizard, their natural predator. It took her turning into a Vulpamancer to turn the tide of the battle." Jen nodded. "Which is when I heard the whistle. Someone's controlling that thing. We need to find out who it is." Rook and Max nodded. "You sound like you have a plan." Jen nodded. "Yeah, but neither of you are going to like it." She sighed slightly. "We need bait to pull this guy out of hiding. And there's only one thing it's been going after so far. Me." Max frowned. "Jen, are you suggesting what I think you're thinking?" She nodded. "But we'll have to stage it right." Rook frowned. "I do not know that I am comfortable using a plumber agent as bait." Jen grinned slightly. "Then it's a good thing I'm not a plumber." Rook frowned. "Hear me out. I've done things like this before, and with less planning behind it." Max frowned. "You've never done this before." "Okay, no, but I have a plan."